Welcome to the first of our Thursday afternoon seminar series. We're especially fortunate, or actually doubly fortunate, that we have Professor Dan Byman to give the first presentation, not least because of his own expertise on the faculty, but also because of the subject, which is hard to imagine a more timely subject than this. In terms of Professor Byman's expertise, he really is someone that needs no introduction, but I'm going to completely embarrass him and give him one. There really is no one like him. I think in the 30 years of my career at think tanks and academia, I mean, Dan is completely unique. He has a resume of publications that's literally like the Manhattan phone book. Just in the past couple of weeks, if you last weekend, I guess 2 weekends ago, if you looked in the Wall Street Journal, there was an extremely prescient article about ISIS and the tragic beheading of James Foley. The week before, there was another article in the Washington Post. But I think what also sets Dan apart, that in addition to be able to communicate to mainstream audiences and to popular audiences through newspaper op-ed pages, through his blogging, for example, through foreign policy online. He also has voluminous scholarly publications, recent articles in security studies, one of the leading journals in the field, books published by the top academic presses, Cambridge University Press, Oxford University Press. And I think Dan embodies exactly the hallmarks of the security studies program. He's not only an accomplished scholar, and even that's an understatement, but he has the real world experience. He started his career in the U.S. intelligence community, subsequently was a staff member on the joint U.S. Senate and House of Representatives joint investigations of the 9/11 attacks, and then was a staff member on the 9/11 Commission as well. So he has an enormously broad perspective, honed regional expertise in the Middle East, and I think what's especially impressive is, unlike many academicians, Dan doesn't do his research from the university library or from the faculty club or from the tombs, but rather gets out in the field. And this research that you'll hear today, I know, is a product of extensive travels that Dan did in Europe and the Middle East this past summer, at least in some of my travels, which were far more modest. People would say to me, oh, I bumped into Dan here, or I met with Dan there. And that's really what gives his research its analytical weight. So Dan, thanks very much for kicking this off. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. That's an especially gracious introduction from Bruce Hoffman, who I think all of you know is probably the world's leading scholar of what I'm about to talk about. So it makes me feel very good and also intimidates me slightly. A few caveats and announcements, actually. The first is simply an announcement that has nothing to do with my talk, which is in about 3 weeks, we, Georgetown, are going to be launching a MOOC, a massive open online course on terrorism and counterterrorism. And I don't suspect all of you, or even most of you, have kind of followed developments in online education. But part of what universities are doing is trying to, I'll say, give some of what they do at the university to the public at large. It's not remotely the equivalent of class in the security studies program or at the university, but it's trying to share some of the knowledge concentrated here with the broader world. And what makes our class, I think, extra special is it's not mine, it's a university class. So we have Professor Hoffman, we have Professor Fair from the Security Studies program, we also have experts from on Islam from our Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, we have experts from our Law Center talking about counterterrorism and law. So it really brings together a lot of what the university has to offer. And for those of you who are interested, I urge you to sign up. On this particular project, to go on to what we're talking about here, this is done, a lot of this work was done with a colleague of mine at Brookings, Shapiro, who's an old friend as well. And since I'm giving the presentation today and he hasn't actually heard or seen what I'm going to say, basically give him credit for the good stuff. But if it's stuff that you find particularly objectionable, it's probably mine. So I want to kind of caveat in both directions here. The title is kind of puts you where I am on the subject, which is there's been a lot of concern, I think appropriate concern, about people going from Europe, people going from the United States to Syria and coming back and doing terrorism. I feel there's a problem, but that the pendulum has gone too far, that there's been tremendous concern expressed, but that concern the degree is not as justified as I think many people feel it is. So just to get my core arguments out there, there's a problem. So I don't want to hear anyone saying, Byman talked and said there's no problem. Okay? Not what I'm saying. Okay? There is a real problem. It's serious. It's real. And people should take it seriously. I don't feel it's catastrophic, though. Right? And I will say to you, should you go down the road and become someone who works on terrorism, and I suspect many of you do already, that's always a very difficult thing to say. Because, God forbid there's an attack tomorrow. Right? And people don't look back and say, Byman predicted lots of attacks and they didn't happen. But they will look back and say, someone told us to be calm and not worry, and something bad happened. Right? So you have to, so it's always dangerous to present even a slightly good news story, which is what I'm going to do. And I would argue that if we choose our policies correctly, we can reduce this problem further. Okay. Now, you could argue in terms of the danger from terrorism that 2014 was perhaps a transitional year. I don't need to tell anyone in this room about the advances of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, really dramatic and certainly not predicted by me. But also on a much more micro scale, we've seen Mehdi Namouche, who was of French origin, going to Syria, coming back and killing 3 in Belgium. We've also seen Abu Saha, among others, Americans conducting suicide attacks in Syria. So we've seen this phenomena touch Europe, touch the United States in a variety of ways. Excuse me one second. Okay. And not surprisingly, we're seeing officials talk about this. And Director Comey's response, I think, is really kind of nails it in terms of, I think, the official concern about this. That, we saw this problem in Afghanistan in the 80s and 90s, and we saw this lead to 9/11. And Syria is that, but as he says, an order of magnitude worse. And I have about 2 million quotes from European officials saying basically the same thing. So I threw one up there. But you can insert the security head of almost every major European country, and many minor ones, and they'll say the same thing. Okay. What is their argument? Okay, the first point, and I think a very important one, is large numbers of people are going off to fight. Now, there are several thousand Europeans in Syria and Iraq right now, over 100 Americans. And if you look at foreigners from the West who have gone to Somalia, who went to Afghanistan, who went to Bosnia, who went to Mali, on and on and on, went to Iraq after 2003, Syria has seen more than all of these combined. Right? So we're seeing a scale that is unlike any other problem. Also, many of these people are admired by their home community. And think about this because it's a big problem for policy. President Obama's policy of many leaders in Europe, is that Assad must go. Right? And many of these people are taking what they feel is their duty into their own hands and trying to get Assad to go, trying to fight him. Right? So these are people who are on, in their eyes, the right side, and often in the eyes of many in their community, are on the right side, that they're fighting against a number of regimes that they feel are illegitimate. Another big problem people talk about is social media. And you can't pick up the paper these days without reading a story about the Islamic State's incredibly sophisticated social media strategy, the use of social media, the use of Twitter, the use of Facebook. And if you think about really, I would say, the generation of most of the people in this audience, you're a social media generation, right? That's how much of how communication is done, much of how knowledge is spread is through social media. And we're seeing that in the Islamic State. Also, what makes Syria a bit different and more dangerous than past jihads, it's really easy to get there. Right? You simply walk across the Turkish border. Turkey in general has done a poor job of trying to stop this flow. There are places in Turkey you could go where you can meet designated recruiters. There are shops where you can buy paraphernalia of these groups. And often you simply show up and walk across the border. If you wanted to get to Afghanistan in the 1980s, or even Pakistan today, it's a much harder problem. You're much more likely to be disrupted and moved. So part of the ease is what makes it so many people going there. And they're going there for lots of different reasons. I mentioned this idea of trying to help the Syrian people, but it's more than this. We saw a spike in European volunteers in 2013, and that was when sectarianism became the nature of the conflict, when it became much less about defeating Assad and much more about, if you're a Sunni Muslim, about going to fight what they feel is illegitimate, apostate, Shia Muslim-dominated regime aided by Iran, aided by Hezbollah. We're also seeing a sense of eschatology. We're seeing a sense that the end of the world is coming. And there are a number of Quranic verses, or a number of hadith that talk about the importance of Syria for the last battles. And this is being played up as the last battles, and people are going, and you see this in the imagery, people are going for that reason. But one thing that's very hard to separate out is the ideals people espouse and the actual reasons they go. And many young men are going because they want a sense of adventure, right? And a sense of belonging, a sense of being cool. And rarely do people say that. You know, I was a little bored, I wanted to be admired, so I went, right? They're much more likely to say, I was upset about blank, I wanted to defend my people. But that sense of adventure is tremendously important. You know, I always think about it in terms of a kind of 19-year-old Lance Corporal. And, oh, we have a mic problem?
We have a car.
Oh, sorry, didn't even notice.
Keep going.
Okay.
I'll just
You
work
fit
around
on,
you.
right. I'll talk while she works. So I always think about it in terms of kind of a 19-year-old Lance Corporal, where, you know, he is certainly motivated by patriotism, desire to defend his country, but there's a lot more going on. It's not like he read James Madison and said, you know, I agree with that particular position in Federalist number 10, and that's why I'm joining you, right? There's a lot more going on, and that's a good thing, right? We as a military, we as a society try to encourage exactly that. Okay, I'm up and running. Great. Okay, now the general model, and this is very much based on Afghanistan, is as follows. Now, when they go to Syria, when they go to Iraq, they go to training camps where they become more skilled. They become more seasoned. Very, very important, they become indoctrinated, right? So they might go because they want some adventure and they don't like the Shia, but while they're there, they're frankly a bunch of 18-year-old kids. And someone says, here's what the conflict's really about. It's really about the United States. It's really about the West. It's really about this broader struggle. And if you look at Muhammad Atta, the cell leader of 9/11, he's someone who wanted to fight in Chechnya, right? That's why he went, and he went to Afghanistan. And while they were there, they redirected him, right? And they said the struggle is part of something bigger. You're a very skilled individual, and that's a very dramatic example, but there are plenty of examples where people go to these hotspots of jihad for one reason and come out with a much more dangerous agenda. And when they come out networked, right? That they might be a few individuals who maybe had a few buddies, but they come out knowing a much broader group of people and more dangerous. And I think the best study of foreign fighters has been the work of Thomas Haghammer. He's a very, in my view, remarkable scholar. And he found that the presence of a foreign fighter has, on average, increased the lethality of a plot, on average, increased the likelihood it's going to succeed. And his general figures show that historically 1 in 9 people who goes to be a foreign fighter joins a jihadist terrorist group, right? And this is, for those of you interested, this is a big definitional question, right? Which is, I like to separate out foreign fighters, people going to fight in largely insurgent conflicts around the world, from those who are joining transnational terrorist groups with the intent of committing terrorism. And the problem is, many of these insurgent groups are also use terrorism. So there's a definitional issue, which is everyone who joins ISIS a terrorist by definition? But many of them are going because of the insurgent conflict involved, and I'll get back to that. Okay. So I'm not sure if all of you can see this. Apologies, but basically it's a fairly simple model, right? You know, you go to fight, you prepare, you travel, you train, you fight, and then you return, and you try to avoid the law enforcement in your country. And then the cycle starts again, right? You do plots, and you recruit, and now you have street credibility, right? You're the guy who fought, you're the guy who people look up to, and they want to be like you. And in fact, not only does the cycle continue, it gets bigger, because you can bring in more people as a result. And I think this is a standard model, in my view, accurately based on what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 1990s. Okay, I think this model is not wrong, but I think it overstates the danger. So I'm going to spend a lot of time on this particular issue, right? Okay, it's based on Afghanistan, but something to remember is that before 9/11 in Afghanistan, much of the world, including the United States, didn't really care about this problem. Right? So people going back and forth, you know, some of them were disruptive, but the vast majority weren't. Ayman Zawahiri fundraised in the United States. Right? There was a U.S. Special Forces officer who was a key member of Al-Qaeda who helped played a major role in planning the 1998 embassy bombings. Right? That sort of thing is much harder after 9/11. I don't want to say it's impossible to go back and forth, but we have to separate out pre-9/11 when no one's paying attention from post-9/11 when the world is paying attention. Okay. Another difference with Afghanistan is you have the Al-Qaeda core there. And a lot of my work and a lot of my interests is in the kind of non-core jihadist groups. And many of these groups share part of Al-Qaeda's agenda, but they're more focused locally and regionally than they are globally. So if you look at a group like the Shabab, right, the Somali diaspora is widespread around the world. They have tremendous potential to reach into Europe, into the United States. But they focus primarily on Somalia, to a lesser degree on the region, so we've seen attacks like the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya. But they haven't gone global. Now the answer might be yet, right? And we've seen Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula do, near-miss attacks in the United States, clearly went global. So it's not a, they never do it sort of statement. But for the most part, these local groups are involved in local conflicts that are very bloody and very demanding, while the Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan now is very anti-American focused and directs its energies there. So there's very much a question of whose hands you fall into when you go there, because they have a different focus. Also, the Al-Qaeda core in Afghanistan, most of what it did is train foreign fighters to be kind of Steve Simon and Dan Benjamin, two policymakers and scholars who wrote a great book, use the term quartermaster of jihad, right? So they're supplying, they're training, they're doing all the logistics for jihad around the world, they're helping insurgent conflicts. But they would take a certain percentage of these and focus on terrorism, right? They had advanced classes, if you will, select classes. To my knowledge, that's much less likely in most of these other conflicts where the training is much more about insurgents. Another point, which is, we've heard these warnings before. Now, when the Iraq War, after the U.S. went in, was at its height, others as well, including some people whose work I greatly respect, said, Iraq War is going to make Afghanistan look like a cakewalk in terms of foreign fighter blowback. Right? Because here you have lots of people going in. It's unlike Afghanistan. This one's about the United States. Right? We invaded this country. We angered the Muslim world. People are going to come back to us. And for the most part, there was not a significant terrorism problem. Now, there were plots. I don't want to say there were none. But the Europeans, I talked to European security officials almost a decade ago about this, and they were freaked out. Those plots did not manifest. Right? We didn't see massive terrorism emanating from Iraq back in Europe. Somalia, before Syria, was the most popular location of Americans going off to fight. We heard warnings that we're going to see attacks again and again, right? That the Somalis are going to come back, it's a disaffected community. Again, we didn't see it. Mali was, by the French, seen as very dangerous. Didn't see it, right? So I don't want to say no danger, right? But it's worth pointing out that many of the things that seem similar to Syria actually went in the opposite direction. Okay, very important mitigating factors. Okay, some are pretty obvious. Some people who go die, and when they die, they don't commit terrorism, right? So it's very hard to get good body counts, but Syria's conflict is exceptionally bloody. Lots of people die. Now, something to think about, and this is kind of geeky analyst to geeky analyst here, which is a certain number of people who went to Syria in the first place might have done attacks anyway back home, right? Had there been no Syria, some of these people were violent and highly motivated and might have attacked back home. So you may start off a little negative, right? Where someone who would have been violent went to Syria and died. Right? And we separate terrorist violence from other forms of violence. But some of these people are thugs, right? And they might not have done terrorism, they might have done assault. Right? But instead they went to Syria and died. Okay? Now, many of them don't die. The vast majority do not die. Some become permanent jihadis. Okay? So you stay on to fight in Syria, you go to the next field of jihad. This is a big problem for the Middle East. That's different from being a problem for Europe and the United States. That people are not going to join the insurgency in France and the United States because there isn't. Right? And when you burn your passport, which many of these people symbolically do, it makes it a lot harder to get back, right? So you have some real problems for these groups. Okay. Many of these people never had an intention of attacking at home, and the abroad experience doesn't change this, right? So the suicide bomber Abu Saha, who we're worried about, who killed himself in Syria, he killed himself in Syria, right? That's both scary, right? There's an American suicide bomber. Yet, there's an American suicide bomber who preferred to attack in Syria, and he was actually with Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a more anti-US group than the Islamic State. There's a question of many come back never wanting to attack at home. There was a Somali who fought there who had a line, I was like, who became a suicide bomber in Somalia. And he was asked about attacks at home. He said, why would I do that? My mom might be walking down the street. Right? That this is home, right? And there's a war going on, I'm going to fight the war. But home is very different. Also important is that many are disillusioned. Right? Now, if you read the kind of memoirs and you read the reports of many of these people, some go and say, this was a taste of true freedom. Finally, I was living in the Islamic State. Finally, I was doing something with my life. Right? But a fair number come back and they say, it was horrible. Right? I was laughed at and abused because I didn't speak the language. I didn't have kin ties there. In general, it was exceptionally bloody. In Syria, you have a huge problem, which is they're mainly killing other Muslims. Right? Not just Shia, but right now you see this tremendous Sunni on Sunni conflict. And it's not what I signed up for, right? I signed up for the movie, where I, the single-handed fighter, blow up a tank. Right? That movie isn't happening, right? And so you have disillusionment, and I would even argue trauma. And finally, this training issue, which is the training to do guerrilla warfare is different than the training to do terrorism. Now there's overlap, right? Learning how to fire a weapon, pretty good for both of them. And especially for European Muslims, firing a weapon is not something that's kind of a birthright, right? So, this guy Namouche who is active, who did the killing in Belgium, it's a good chance to me he would have been less successful had he not gone to Syria, because he might not have known how to fire a weapon. But also, he didn't know clandestine tradecraft. He didn't work with established networks. He did a lot of things that a trained terrorist would not do. And I think it's because his training was different. Now, that may change, but for now, the training is insurgent related. Okay, finally getting off that. Okay, I mentioned this issue that the groups are less focused on the United States. Every one of these groups that we're talking about is anti-American and anti-European. Okay, and you can judge that from the statements of the leaders. You can look at the endless Twitter results. People who go there talk about this, so no question. The question to me is not, are they anti-American, but how much they prioritize the struggle against America. Right? And there's going to be variation. Now, U.S. intervention in Iraq could change this, right? I did most of this research when we were not actually attacking the Islamic State. Now we are. So the beheadings have been labeled a statement to America. Right? To me, it's a different issue if someone is, I'll say, both brave enough to kind of enter Syria and do serious reporting and do serious aid work. I give them credit for that. That's a different type of threat than the threat to the homeland, which is what the focus of this paper and my talk is about. But the U.S. intervention in Iraq could change this. We could make the problem worse. But even worth pointing out, even the groups based in Iraq were not focused on the U.S. homeland. Even though we were decimating their ranks on a daily or weekly basis for several years. Right? So just because we're attacking them doesn't mean they automatically go after the U.S. homeland. Okay. One of the biggest factors missing, though, is people ignore the role of the security services. Right? And ironically, the security services themselves ignore their own role. So I said, look, pre-9/11 Afghanistan, no one's looking. All of a sudden, September 12, 2001, all these cells around the world get rolled up. Right? If you look at the papers for a year afterward, it seems like the sky is falling because there are jihadists everywhere. But the real difference is we actually put the magnifying glass up, and we saw all these things we weren't even looking for before. In most countries, including in the United States, the security services have become plugged into local communities. Right? And they are the first to tell you we don't know everyone, we're afraid that people are going to slip through, on and on and on. I'm sure that's true. But they made a diligent effort at the state, local, and in the U.S. case, federal level to try to be involved with local communities, to have informers with local communities, to have friendly relations, and there's a lot of variation in this around Europe, right? And there's a term people use called suspect communities. Communities where they're treated as suspect, minorities treated as suspect, and therefore doesn't cooperate with the police. Because they don't cooperate with the police, they're treated in a more hostile way, therefore they become even more ostracized. You can see the circle going. So this is a real concern, but compared to 9/11, at least, that era, there's a tremendous shift in involvement. But a big one is social media. Okay? This is a particular pet peeve of mine, right? Which is, Mark Lynch said, this is the most socially mediated conflict ever, right? The Syria war. But if you are a foreign fighter, you're going there not in a clandestine way. You're going there in an open way because you're a hero, right? You're going there in an open way because you want to brag to your buddies back home about what you're doing. right? You want to pose with a picture of yourself on top of beheaded corpses, on top of destroyed armor, whatever makes you look cool with an AK-47, right? And there is this kind of classic, your job is to clean latrines, but you do have the picture taken of yourself, with the AK-47, right? And so you can tell your buddies back home you're pretty cool. But you're doing this all the time. But if you think about the intelligence implications of this, it's staggering, right? If I know who your Twitter followers are, if I know who your Facebook friends are, I pretty much know your network. And the big intelligence challenge for terrorism always was, how do you find the person who hasn't done anything yet, who hasn't shown up on the radar screen, right? This person who you don't know has been radicalized. Well, we still don't have a perfect answer to that, but a better answer is I'm going to say he, it's usually he goes to Syria. Okay, so he raises his hand and says, I'm going to Syria. Oh, come, pay attention to that guy. Right? Or he at least follows or is friends with someone who's going to Syria. Right? And you can do analyses that show, I actually follow some of these people, so maybe I'm a suspect, but a number of people who do this sort of thing, who follow lots of people, who are constantly back and forth, who are going to private chat rooms, those show up on the intelligence radar screen, right? And the National Security Agency has been saying for 13 years now, we're hearing chatter, right? And yet, these people chatter on, right? And it's because, in my view at least, they're not thinking of themselves as a clandestine organization. They're thinking of themselves as a guerrilla army, right? So why do you have to hide? Right? What am I, I'm not hiding it, burrowing into society. Now, some of them can go over there, learn, and change, but many of them have already identified themselves to the security services through their social media activity, through their community ties. This also, by the way, in terms of prosecution, incriminates them, right? Which is, you say, dude, I joined the Islamic State, here's a picture of me over a dead body. That can and will be used against you in a court of law, right? I mean, this is something that, in Europe, it's actually, to me, quite charming in a way, because your stereotypes of the different societies show up, right? So, talk to the French, and they're like, oh, yeah, we wouldn't even need that to prosecute. We could definitely put them all in jail. And, you talk to the Danes, and they're like, well, it might just be a picture they're taking. It's very, very sweet, right? And so there's variation within this, but it generally works. Okay, policy. At each stage of this process, better policy can help the problem. Right? So an obvious point is you want to work with these communities because you want to dissuade people from going in the first place. Right? It's not a good thing if someone goes off to Syria to fight. Right? So you try to dissuade them. You try to get the community to point out troublemakers. A big thing is, most parents don't want their kids to go off and fight. Right? The parents aren't stupid. And so a danger the parents feel is, if I tell the police, will the police just arrest my kid? Right? So are there counseling programs, are there community programs to stop people from going in the first place that the community feels comfortable with? You don't want to drive this underground. Some of these people you have to put in jail when they come back. No question about it. Right? Some are violent and dangerous. Okay? Not even a question. However, much of the time you're putting them in jail for minor things for only a couple years without much thought about who belongs in jail. And the result is, in jail they become radicalized. Right? In jail they develop networks. And this is especially true in Europe. Huge problem for France. And so the jail problem seems like a solution, right? It's like a bad cop show, right? So-and-so is now serving time in the federal penitentiary, right? Case closed. But it's really, all you're doing is delaying a problem for 2 years and arguably making it worse. Turkey. There's tremendous potential to work more with Turkey. And Turkey has improved somewhat in the last 3 months. Right? But Turkey can do a much better job securing its border, can do a better job securing its airport. It can identify people going back and forth. Turkey has a very good intelligence service. The Turks are a little frustrated because they say, we've had a terrorism problem for several decades called the Kurdish Workers' Party, PKK. And the rest of Europe kind of laughed at us and ignored it. And so there's fundraising cells and militant cells all around Europe. And we never got any help, so you want our help now, huh? Terrorism problem. I do think effective and concerted pressure can change this. Also taking the Turks a bit more seriously in their own terrorism problems. But to me, Turkey really is a potential point here. Many of the groups mistrust the foreigners, right? So now that we're getting, I'm going from this question of kind of before they go to the next stage of when they're in transit to now when they're there. Many groups mistrust the foreigners. You can play on that. right? You could do psychological operations that talk about, we found out from spies within the groups that this happened, right? And when that happens, the groups tend to look around at the foreigners and say, you're all spies, right? And at the very least, not welcome war, and at times much nastier things, but you don't want the groups to welcome foreigners. A big question, though, is when people come back, you have to triage. This is a huge problem for European services, especially the small ones. Right? There are some countries like Britain and France that have large services, have been dealing with this problem in various forms for decades. The United States has a large service and a relatively small problem compared to population. Belgium has a small service. Belgium has not been dealing with this problem for decades, and has a huge number of fighters. Last I checked, over 300. Right, so 3 times as many as the United States in Belgium. Right, so there'll be some countries that have to triage, but when you triage, you make mistakes. Right, you're going to say this person doesn't seem as dangerous, and then they do something nasty. And when the people I talked to in a small service said, this is what gets our director fired. Right, that this is the sort of mistake that, in hindsight, seems foolish, even though it's a necessity at the time. Okay, a few more thoughts. Okay, when you're trying to de-radicalize when people come back, it's very rarely does it work to say, hey, your whole society is a wonderful place. Right? It's much more effective when you talk about the horrors of the particular group. So you talk about their misinterpretations of Islam, but an especially effective one is the fighting these groups are doing with other jihadist groups. Right? So that there are 4 people going, and a couple end up with Jabhat al-Nusra, a couple end up with the Islamic State, and they shoot at each other. So you want to go to Syria, that's what your fight's about, right? You want to spread that word that this is a fight within the jihadist community, fight within the Sunni community, not a righteous fight. Okay. PTSD. I would say probably the least popular social program I can imagine would be a community and counseling program for returned jihadists. Right? And if I'm going to pitch that to Congress, I don't particularly want to do that one. But a number of these people are going to come back traumatized. We talk about this problem with American veterans, who, with a few exceptions, are for the most part far more stable when they went over to fight, were with units that were well structured, had support networks in place. There are support networks when they come home. It's far from perfect, and we recognize it as a huge problem. Syria, the fighting is much more savage. The structures are not there. Many of these people have to go underground. And so you're going to have people who are traumatized, and they'll do violence. And we'll blame the violence on terrorism, right? Because this is a guy who came back from Syria, right? And he said he did in the name of Islam. But it could have been prevented by recognizing the mental disturbance created by this. So when people come back, part of this triage program has to be a recognition that for some of these people, rather than jail, counseling may be the best option, because they'll get out of jail in a few years. And the counseling may be more needed for the long term. Again, politically an exceptionally difficult issue. Obligatory reference to intelligence sharing. Most of my findings depend on having security services that are resourced. One of the biggest things about Syria that does make it different than other conflicts is there are more people going there. It's just a size problem, right? So if you say, only a fraction of the people going will cause a problem, if you have enough people going, that's a big problem. So you need security services to be resourced, because monitoring people, following up on people, that takes bodies, right? It's not just a question of technology, it's a question of people. And ironically, there's a tension, which is the less problem that manifests, the less resources you devote to the problem, right? And I'm saying that in order to keep the problem from manifesting, you need a significant number of resources to it. Okay, and my last major point is that you want the focus to continue on Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Al-Qaeda core. Right? I actually see the Al-Qaeda core as incredibly dangerous. Professor Hoffman has a book that'll be coming out in a couple weeks that talks about the core's role in, I would say, certainly almost every major significant terrorist plot we've seen since 9/11. Right? So the core is real, it's active, and it's anti-American. Right? So if your concern is attacks on the U.S. homeland, if your concern is attacks on Europe, for now at least, to me, the core should remain the priority, even though obviously the Islamic State is emerging as a concern. So I'll end with yet one more graph that you probably can't see, which is, if you think about every stage of this, decide to fight, travel, train, return, plot, there are different ways to try to head this off in terms of both mitigating factors and policies, right? There are ways at every stage, and what you're doing to me is you're taking probabilities at each stage and making them lower. Right? So there are still going to be plenty of, if you do everything I say, there are still going to be people who decide to go and fight in Syria. but fewer of them. If you do everything I say, there are still going to be people who transit Turkey, but fewer of them. There's still going to be people who train and are indoctrinated, fewer. And on and on and on, and that makes the problem more manageable to the security services, which can make them even more effective. So there are ways to mitigate this problem, not end. And I'll stress that. Something for you to think about, and this is a very tough question, which is, what is the baseline for terrorist attacks? Right? Imagine there were no Syria war, okay? That magically solved, and every fighter picks up a plowshare, right? How many terrorist attacks would you expect in Europe or the United States in the next 5 years? Because if your answer is 0, to me that's unrealistic. Right? But the question to me is, if in 2 years we do see an attack, say like the Boston Marathon, that's low tech, kills a few people, not networked, are we going to declare that a failure? Are we going to say that this is a failure of counterterrorism? And at a tactical level, of course it is, right? There's always something more that could have been done. But realistically, we don't expect every plot to be solved. And so my question is, how many more plots and how many more successful plots will the Syria and Iraq war add to what would have otherwise have been the case? I don't know the answer to that, and even in hindsight, I won't know the answer to that. But we have to think in terms of a realistic baseline rather than perfection as an objective. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to comments from Professor Hoffman from both. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great research, but also a really impressive model of concision, especially for students who have to brief in their classes. This is pretty much an exemplar. Let me start, and perhaps not surprisingly, takes a slightly opposite view, especially because this morning I gave a similar presentation, although not to an audience that I could see. It was over the internet. One of our former students and your former research assistant, Tess DeBlanc-Knowles, who works at the U.S. Special Operations Command, arranged a just by coincidence, same sort of topic. And I came to, I don't know, a different conclusion, but certainly more pessimistic. But I suppose, you're much more optimistic in general. You can see probably the styles of the program, and Dan led it compared to me. But let me tell you what I had said, sort of, to push back against some of your points that I think, or why we should be worried. And my title was Winter is Coming. So, Game of Thrones. So, for me, what the biggest difference is, and why I'm very worried, much more worried than I was even, many people were worried 15 years ago, but more worried now. And I think the big wild card in this that will drive not only the number of attacks outside of the region, but even attacks in Europe and even in the United States, is one factor you didn't address, and that's the competition between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm never sure I use this word right, because it's not my generation's word, but the meme sort of within the Beltway from roughly January until, at least I was hearing it until the end of May, was that this is great that core Al-Qaeda has expelled ISIS. Both groups are going to be weakened and disappear, and smooth sailing, we're done. I mean, this is very, very serious people who are arguing this. And my point then, we'll see, and it hasn't been realized yet, well, it has to an extent, was that this is the worst thing that could actually, I mean, it's not bad, it's not undesirable. It wasn't that I was all for ISIS remaining with Al-Qaeda, but I was much more worried than many of these people, because at least historically, rivalries between terrorist groups have led to much more intense competition, and often an outbidding process which takes a conflict that may be local and all of a sudden transforms it into an international conflict, as both groups compete with one another and therefore try to outdo one another by escalating the violence and by broadening the ambit of their attacks against the great Satan, as it were. So that to me is a significant difference that makes me very worried. And we've already seen it, because ISIS has certainly been competing with core Al-Qaeda, actually has trumped it. Second thing that worries me is that Zawahiri has publicly said that he's sort of holding back for the time. And Jabhat al-Nusra, I think, has remained very focused locally, but you wonder, once the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan, which I think is core Al-Qaeda's main concern, whether they might not ramp up, or whether they just haven't been preparing. I mean, just the other day, Zawahiri announced the formation of a new Al-Qaeda affiliate in South Asia. and said, we've been preparing this for 2 years. I mean, it's probably nonsense, but the point is, though, core Al-Qaeda, I think, still thinks about things. And one of the biggest threats from ISIS and Iraq is that all of a sudden now, in completely typical Washington fashion, everybody's focused on Iraq and forgetting about Afghanistan, which of course we did once before, to our peril. I worry. I mean, I agree in the main with your analysis. So mine's really the margins. And one thing I worry about attacks in the United States is, about a year ago, was it last May? Yeah, it was just this past May. No, I'm sorry, it was a year ago May. There was an article in the front page of the Washington Post. This is May 2013. That was like heralding, all these officials talking about the resilience that was shown after the Boston Marathon, and the United States is a very different place than it was after 9/11. And we didn't panic, we didn't go around and invade other countries. Well, it's all true, but of course 3 people tragically died in Boston compared to 3,000 in New York. But more to the point, what worries me is that at the end of the day, a teenager and a slightly elder brother paralyzed Boston and shut down Logan Airport. And if I was in ISIS or any of the Al-Qaeda arms waiting for the green light from Zawahiri, I'd say, gosh, if these 2 morons can do this, boy, especially with the training I've gotten on the battlefield, this will be a cakewalk. Also, I worry the Muammar Mohammed Abu Salah is, to me, enormously frightening, because this is one of the problems, too, is that most of the focus, even of our security services and intelligence services, tends to be on foreign fighters when there's some carriage of weapons or evidence that they're training in a training camp. Absolutely. But Abu Salah, who was on social media, he was on a humanitarian mission. And I think our tracking, and certainly many of our European allies, ability to track people who say we're going, much like in the 90s, for charitable works. Abu Salah didn't even go through Turkey, went through Jordan, and there's 1 million Syrian refugees there. This is an important humanitarian issue and a disaster. So, unfortunately, he was radicalized, and then he came back, and we missed him, which also makes me worried. You're absolutely right that the foreign fighters from Iraq didn't trigger terrorism anywhere else. But of course, the whole struggle in Iraq and U.S. intervention led to Madrid and London. So we have to deal with that. And then I guess the other thing that makes me, this is much a challenge. I think this is just the more pessimistic version. I'm giving you the 2-minute version of what my presentation was this morning. Turkey to me is a huge problem in the sense that a lot of this wouldn't have been possible without them. I think the cooperation is still lagging. And the front page of the Wall Street Journal this morning that talked about things. And I think, with Turkey, it's had more to do with Erdogan's pretension. I think Erdogan wanted to take credit for overthrowing Assad, and therefore really, much like the Pakistanis and the ISI, made a pact with the devil to permit this promiscuous flow of fighters, whether they're ISIS or Jabhat al-Nusra or whoever. Every intelligence service in the world 2 years ago believed Assad only had 6 months, and that's what's backfired. And I think that even now Turkey is still having trouble changing course. So that's why I'm much more worried. But it's also why I hope you're right.
I think I'll, for the most part, vehemently agree. All your points are valid. On rivalry, it does make it more dangerous. One thing to think about in general for, if you will, causes of terrorism is often a cause of terrorism is failure. Right? That there were other strategies, other approaches that groups were pursuing, and they didn't work. Right? And that could be conventional war, it could be guerrilla war, it could be political mobilization. And because of that, a certain segment of them embraced terrorism. And so, ironically, we want the jihadist groups in Syria to get weaker. It's good in a whole variety of ways, but there's a cost to that. Right? And I've argued that part of the reason the Shabab did the Westgate Mall attack in Kenya was because they were losing on the ground in Somalia. They were getting weaker and weaker, they were being discredited. And this was a way of grabbing attention, of rebranding themselves, a classic use of terrorism, which is a limited attack that has high psychological value, grabs a lot of attention. And so certainly I think the rivalry is a danger. My hope, but hope is not policy, right? My hope is that, so far at least, the momentum of the Muslim world is much more about sectarianism than it used to be. Right? And this is, I think, a bad thing for a number of other reasons. But it means the competition is often about who can stand up to supposed apostate governments in Syria, in Iraq, who can fight Hezbollah, on, and that's where the money is, right? So when people are saying, let's fight the United States, even let's fight Israel, it seems a bit tired, right? It's not what's grabbing the attention of the kind of 19-year-old male, especially in the Muslim world. And so the question is, where will the competition manifest? And I think most of it's going to manifest on that question. But I do think terrorism, at least terrorist plots, are more likely as a result of competition and of weakness. On Boston, that's to me kind of a fascinating thing, right? If my list of failed predictions is extremely long, and one of the ones that I think is quite dramatic, where I was not alone, was on September 12th. I, like many other people who worked on terrorism, was asked, will there be another attack? I said yes. Gave a list of reasons why, and I was, in my view, I was wrong, right? Because I wasn't saying in the next 13 years, somewhere there'll be some attack where a few people die. Right? I was thinking of a big attack, right? And my view of Boston is, I actually think we did panic, right? Now we got the guys, right? But we shut down the city, right? It was a massive cost in terms of society, and I think in terms of social resilience in this country, the ability to kind of live with violence is actually remarkably low and has not gotten better. Perhaps even has gotten worse, right? Because there is this heightened sense of the danger of terrorism. Now, I don't want to dismiss this, right? I would worry about my kids if there were a terrorist attack in Washington, even though statistically I could tell you they're much more likely to be hit by a car that same day, right? That, just in terms of raw numbers, they shouldn't worry about terrorism. But I do worry about social resilience policy and how to think about that. And I'll add to that, one danger I didn't mention is lone wolves, right? And the lone wolf problem is a nightmare from an intelligence point of view, because by definition, many of the things you look for, networks, training, and so on, are often lacking, right? So people act who you don't know of. And I do believe some lone wolves will be caught because they're in touch with the wrong people. But the violence in Syria, the U.S. response in Iraq, to me, makes the lone wolf problem more likely. So I think we may see a bigger lone wolf problem. If the lone wolf problem is all we face, again, I don't want to dismiss the tragedy of unnecessary death. But if that's all we face in the coming years, then that's a counterterrorism success, even though it'll look like failure, right? It'll look like people didn't do their job. But if the answer after 9/11 is a big problem we're going to face is something like the Tsarnaev brothers in Boston, then well done FBI, well done CIA, right? If that's the kind of scale of problem that is freaking us out. Finally, Turkey, Professor Hoffman's absolutely right? That Turkey allowed this problem for its own reasons to manifest and could be doing much better. Again, I do see this, much of what I recommend for policy is very hard to implement. When we talk about de-radicalization, that sounds great, but the actual programs are very iffy. It's, they're of uncertain effectiveness and so on. Getting Turkey to secure the border and crack down, that can be done. And so I think Turkey has a long way to go, and that's where I'd concentrate a lot of immediate attention.
Questions? I'll let you.
Sure. Yes. Sure. Jabhat al-Nusra is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, right? It has, accepted Zawahiri's direction. And Zawahiri's, stated aims and stated objectives are more anti-Western, anti-American. Now, Al-Qaeda has multiple objectives, right? And they include going after local apostate regimes. ISIS, which is more locally and regionally focused, still doesn't like the United States, right? So I don't want to make it sound like you do a sharp turn in one direction or the other. But if you had asked me 9 months ago, which group am I more concerned about regarding attacks on the United States, I would have said Jabhat al-Nusra. It's much more open about its wanting to be part of Al-Qaeda. And part of what Al-Qaeda has tried to do when it's had new affiliates is turn them into, I would say, more regional versions of itself. So what we've seen in Al-Qaeda of the Islamic Maghreb is they go after UN targets, say. They go after Western targets in their region. Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, of course, went after US targets. So to me, Jabhat al-Nusra was more likely to go in that direction at a regional level and perhaps even a global level. So just comparing the two of them, I would say Jabhat al-Nusra should be more likely to strike in the United States, but in terms of actual manifestations, I think we've seen limited on both sides. Professor Egel? start with Europe and then ask you to comment on the policy side. Yes, I think it is more of a problem for Europe, and in a number of ways. First of all, again, there's just a lot of variation in Europe, right? We have some countries that have a much bigger problem relative to population, and you have some that have less effective security services. So, one big problem. You also have this problem of marginalized communities, right? In the United States, the Muslim American community, on average, is better educated, wealthier than the non-Muslim community, right? It's not a marginalized community. Now, the Somali American community is an exception to that and has a deeper problem. There's a very different issue with the Nation of Islam, right, which is, I think, its own category. But that often means, it doesn't mean that the communities necessarily are thrilled with the latest absurd statement about how people are trying to have Sharia replace the Constitution of the United States, right? It's not that they don't think there's any sense of hostility or discrimination out there. But if you look at the attacks or the plots that the FBI has disrupted, a huge number come from, of the leads came from supportive community members, where someone said, hey, there are these kids, something's going on with them, right? And that's a very good sign. So to me, I think the problem is bigger in Europe. The question is how big. And I do think there will be some attacks, but the question again is how many and what lethality.
I agree the problem's bigger in Europe. So just to add to what Professor Byman said, the trouble is in terrorism, people have short memories, and everything, of course, is new. This beheading now is somehow viewed as a new phenomenon. Of course, the same group, although it was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was doing the same thing in 2004. Nicholas Berg was the first, unfortunately, of many. In September 2010, Bin Laden called on the affiliates to undertake Mumbai-style attacks in Europe. No one could do it. They didn't have the training. They didn't have the logistical infrastructure. Another thing that worries me and endlessly fuels my pessimism is that they certainly have the abilities now from the training they've received in Syria. They have the confidence, as Professor Byman points out. So I think, whenever the green light is given, I think, or whenever ISIS, for example, deems it desirable to expand elsewhere, especially as a coalition intervention may emerge from the summit in Wales, they'll be able to do it, whereas they couldn't 4 years ago. And this for ISIS will be tremendous. I mean, one of the other things, Bin Laden promised, to change the world and reestablish the caliphate. To an extent, he changed the world, but he certainly didn't redraw the borders in the Middle East. And ISIS has done that, and they've reestablished the caliphate. I think the third pillar for them would be to implement Bin Laden's orders from 2010 that Al-Qaeda couldn't do. The distance, of course, is a huge factor. I mean, you just get in a car and drive from Turkey. Once you get into the European community, you can cross into Greece. You're in essence home free. And I think Professor Byman points about security services potentially overwhelmed by the numbers of fighters. This is an enormous problem too. I think it's very different from the past, and it also includes the United States, as we're confronting a problem now that's much more complex and much more complicated, and also has far larger numbers than the Afghan volunteers ever were, with diminishing resources. I mean, we're looking to cut our GDP as a percent of defense spending by a full percent in the coming years. In May, the Army announced that they were going to release another 10,000 personnel this year and 20,000 personnel next year. And according to the UN, 6,000 people joined ISIS alone in July. So a lot of the trends are bad. And I think that there's the logistics and support networks in Europe that don't exist in the United States that make attacks here much more difficult. Although I think if 2 or 3 people could sneak into the United States, or 2 or 3 people were U.S. citizens, and they could very easily replicate the Westgate Mall attack at Tyson's Corner, the Fashion Center in Pentagon City, and of course, the psychological consequences would be enormous. In terms of the policy options, I think Professor Byman laid them out exactly right. Although I would just add one, and doubtless this is being discussed even while we speak here. The Europeans have always tended to look at terrorism as a law enforcement problem. You can see that the older I get, the more hawkish and the more pessimist I apologize for that. I can only imagine 5 years from now when I'm teaching at SSP what I'll be like. But, this to me is both. And, there was the problem is, I think, when everyone looks at terrorism, just as Professor Byman does, we swing in opposite pendulums. Either we over-exaggerate the problem, and we did over-exaggerate elements of it in the past 13 years, or we also underestimate it. Very rarely do we get it right. Now, admittedly, not every counterterrorism problem is amenable or should involve military force, but I think ISIS has gotten to be such a large problem that you're going to have, you know, the law enforcement model is great, but it's got to be combined with some military action. I think we're at a pivotal time to see, firstly, what President Obama can fashion in terms of a response and what kind of coalition and what kind of military support will be given to some sort of an operation that more decisively turns back the tide of ISIS.
In the way back. No, that's a huge tension, which is what's good for American allies isn't always good for the United States and vice versa, right? Which is, there are different ways to think about a terrorist group. And one is, you know, the weaker it is, right? That's a good thing. Another is this question of priorities, right? So I remember, you know, shortly after the Iraq War broke out, talking to I'll say a senior European intelligence official, to protect his name. And I said, you know, you just gave me a very pessimistic view of what's going on in your country and all the problems. Why haven't we seen attacks? He said, oh, thank God for the Danish cartoons. You know, he goes, they're all going over there, right? And, you know, so the question of both, not just capability, but prioritization, right? And as you take away a group, you know, if you go after the state, if you go after what values, I think they are much more likely to strike back, right? I think that we've increased the danger of a terrorist attack, even though it may be a very good thing in terms of weakening the overall group. And I think we have regional interests, right? I mean, when you do a research project, you bound the problem, right? And one problem I'm not talking about is the threat the Islamic State poses to U.S. interests in the Middle East, which I think is quite real, right? So to me, there's a tension between these goals, but I think you've identified a core issue that, you know, I hope senior policymakers are thinking about as they're weighing the best way to go forward. Great. Yes? On the facilitation networks, one of the things that makes Syria, I would say, a bigger problem than in the past is you really don't need a facilitation network to get there if you're a European who wants to go find it, right? And you can go on Facebook and Twitter, show up in certain parts of Turkey, and they'll help you across the border. It's not a particularly difficult phenomenon. It's not like going to a clandestine training camp in Pakistan today, right? So the facilitation network is less necessary. When these people come back, there are two dynamics, one positive, one negative. They are ideal recruiters, right? As you know, I suspect a number of you know, the U.S. Army had a surge in recruitment when it changed its recruiting system to give individual soldiers bonuses when they recruited friends, right? So you have, you know, again, to go back to kind of, you know, a 19-year-old interested in enlisting in the Army or the Marines, a lot more credible than some, you know, military recruiter my age saying, you know, make a man of you, right? Is to have someone who is a friend, who is close to his age, who's come back from combat and talks about it in a serious way. And that had much more appeal, right? So you have these people who are admired by their local community, are seen as heroic, are seen as having credibility. And so they're far more effective recruiters. The flip side is, you know, the Benjamin Franklin line, you know, of 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead, right? Is that Franklin? Anyway, it's the bigger the network grows, the more likely you are to wrap it all up, right? And again, because many of these foreign fighters are on the radar screen, right? When they come back, everyone they touch is on the radar screen. So I think if your goal is to run a clandestine operation in Europe, you want to be really careful about the returning foreign fighters, because they're ideal recruits, they're ideal recruiters, but they're also potentially known to security services. I would say, yes, it is in the interest of the United States to do so. It's almost always better to do intelligence liaison and cooperation than unilaterally, because the locals have so much more resources, right? I mean, we think of the U.S. intelligence community as massively resourced, which it is compared to most communities, but, you know, compare it to the Chicago Police Department, right? If you want to find out what's going on in Chicago, you could send the FBI to do a clandestine operation, or you could ask the police, who have a presence on every block, right? And so you want to work with the locals just for manpower reasons, even in places like Belgium. United States has two things that it can offer. One are very sophisticated capabilities others don't have. I'll single SIGINT in particular, right? We're very, very good at SIGINT. And, you know, the Europeans are in a bit of a quandary here, right? Because after having thrown stones at US SIGINT for a long time, right, to say, you know, boy, it's really necessary is, you know, a little hard for them politically, but really good at it. We are also, I always think of it as kind of the conductor of an orchestra, where there can be a training camp in Syria connected with a fundraising cell in Saudi Arabia, connected with a transit spot in Turkey, connected with a cell in France that wants to do an operation over the border in Germany, right? And it's hard for all those services to work together, but it's easier for them all to work with the United States. And we can help put the information together, we can help coordinate the response. So I think the US has a big role to play, but it depends, you know, it's a diplomatic relationship, right? These are allies, not puppets. And so we have to convince them it's in their interest, we have to show respect for what they bring to the table, for their laws. And so to me, that is a much more effective strategy overall if we can win their cooperation rather than try to go around them. Great. Yes? I have to be careful here is, I don't consider myself a scholar of Russia or China. So I do study security in general. But you know, there are many limits to what I know, but that's certainly high on the list. What I would say though is there's a question of resources, not just in terms of money, but in terms of time and attention. There was a good article in the New York Times today that talked about 3 challenges for Obama, right? One is China being more assertive in East Asia. The other, of course, is Ukraine and the challenge of NATO. And the last is the Islamic State. Right? And, you know, everyone who has worked in a senior level of government, and I have not, says, you'd be amazed, but it's actually hard for the government to chew bubblegum and walk, right? That the Secretary of State only has so many hours in his day, right? So that doesn't mean the government shuts down when the Secretary of State is not paying attention or the President is not paying attention, but there is a resource issue. And to go back to Professor Hoffman's point, when you talk about levels of military forces and so on, you know, to say to the U.S. military, become more involved in Iraq and Syria, prepare for a major response to Russia should the situation escalate, and by the way, pivot to Asia, and we're going to cut your budget. That really can't be done particularly well, right? You know, a lot of what policy is about is making choices. And so, yes, I think it actually has a significant impact because it limits, you have to make choices and you have to prioritize. And you know, the 4th thing on the list is budget constraints, right? So you have to think of all that. And I don't think of any of these problems as insurmountable, but I do see them as they should be shaping how we allocate forces, which means in some theaters will be more limited than others. Great. Yes? Bruce, I'll let you
I was about to say, it's not my seminar, so I'm glad Dan was going to answer first. Well, I mean, insurgency is, you know, probably the least palatable word, or counterinsurgency, I should say, in Washington now. But you're right. I mean, that's in essence what the problem is, because ISIS has gone, you know, far below what is a terrorism group, and in fact, sort of blows apart the definition of terrorism. I have it inside terrorism because they're holding territory and exercising sovereignty over a population. But again, as you know from the insurgency course, insurgents use terrorist tactics. So I don't know if they quite rewrite it yet. I would disagree with your analysis about Afghanistan. I think Afghanistan, 13 years ago, that it failed because we immediately wrenched our attention to Iraq, completely denuded Afghanistan of intelligence and civil affairs assets, concentrated everything on Iraq, and then the problem, it still took a few years before it surfaced, but then it resurfaced in Afghanistan, and we were still focused on Iraq up until after the surge was successful, arguably up until 2010, and by then we lost the will, you know, to carry on the fight. So, you know, the only game in town, in fact, I mean, you're quite right, there aren't going to be large numbers of ground forces committed. So the only game, well, 2 games. One is, I think, one of the biggest lessons from the past 13, 14 years, especially for the United States, is that it has to be a true coalition. Not just the United States leading people and not caring if they're with us, but the publics of any of our countries, whether in Europe, the United States, or even probably locally in the region, won't tolerate this unless it's, you know, a joint effort. And the United States has to lead, and lead from the front, not from behind. kind. So that, I think, is the first imperative. Secondly, it will be largely, I think, special operations. Right now, there's legislation in Congress to change the AUMF to ensure that the military still has the power to do those kinds of things. I mean, that's another issue that we haven't talked about when the AUMF expires, and also involving groups that aren't Al-Qaeda. But for that, you need intelligence, and that means it's going to take a while to build up those assets, which gets the last element, which is inherent to counterinsurgency, is having the patience. But I don't think we have much alternative, because, and you're right, military action, I mean, this is exactly the balance we have to strike with applying enough that we are systematically dismantling ISIS, even though we're going to play into their narrative that the United States is waging war on Islam and invading Muslim countries yet again. But if we're going to do it, we may as well do it and weaken them. It's, that's why I think why we need military force, and they can't just be half measures. And then the bottom line too is, I think what you described, goes back to Sun Tzu's principle, about tactics without strategy. The president himself admitted last week we don't have a strategy. Well, if we don't have a strategy, we shouldn't be doing anything, because that is a recipe for disaster. But having the strategy, I think, then will allow for the application of tactics and hopefully the patience that we will be able to make progress and sort of restabilize the region.
I'll add very briefly. I don't think there is a short or medium-term answer to this beyond, effectively, I'll use the word containment, but not in a traditional Cold War sense of that word, but simply trying to stop the problem from getting worse. And so this means a mix of trying to weaken the group directly with trying to build up neighbors, to trying to strengthen local opponents. And it will lead to a lot of strange bedfellows, right? Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is working directly with forces that are fighting the Islamic State that we're also fighting, right? We refuse to coordinate with Bashar al-Assad because our policy is that his regime has to fall because it's horrible. But we're actively, fighting his enemies as well, right? So it leads to a lot of bizarre problems in our diplomacy. And the hope is that over time, local capacity grows of more moderate elements. The group's own divisions weaken it. But again, that's a hope, right? I would not want to say that it will definitely happen. I think most of the alternatives that are more likely to lead to success have much higher costs and much higher risks. I mean, it's a relatively small group, right? I mean, I have no doubt that it could be militarily crushed with a fair amount of ease. It's a relatively good fighting group in part because everyone it's fighting is very bad, right? So, that's always a tough measure, but it's halfway decent, right? But, take a larger end estimate of its size, it's 20,000 people, right? And that's not particularly overwhelming, right? And we talk about having armor and so on, we're not talking about a disciplined armor corps, right? We're talking about enough armor to really scare and overwhelm scattered bands of opponents. So it can be taken militarily. I just think not only is there not public appetite for a large conventional U.S. military presence, I actually think it'd be a mistake for a variety of reasons. So I think we end up with a kind of management and containment approach, which is not satisfying in any way, because it means we'll have the problem of Syria, the problem of the Islamic State for years to come. But again, I think sometimes the best you can do is prevent the problem from getting worse. Yes? It's possible to me that the U.S. involvement may lead to an increase in foreign fighters. There is an anti-American agenda, but the much bigger factor to me is the Islamic State's military success. Right? It's a winner. Right? It's an organization that has done very well on the ground. And so it can credibly say, we're producing results, right? To go back to Professor Hoffman's point about competition. Unlike all our rivals, we're doing something, right? And we're creating an Islamic State here on the ground, we're defeating opponents, we're killing the bad guys, all these things. And to me, that success, and bound up in that is the U.S. response, that's the more powerful tool. Although I'm sure there will be some who are excited that it's taking on the United States. I think that's a relatively small number compared to those who just are happy to join what they see as a winner. Yes?
I'm Josh. We're now first year student here at SSP. You mentioned some policy things. I was wondering, do you have any recommendations for specific steps the United States can take against or to pressure Turkey to stem the flow across their border?
Gotcha. Part of it is I think name and shame, right? Which is to Turkey prides itself as a responsible member of the European world, if you will, even though Erdogan is trying to move it towards a more nationalist identity, for lack of a better term, and religious nationalist, still sees itself on that side. And so pointing out that they're not fulfilling their duty on a basic state level, I think is one thing. Another is to show some respect when they're voicing their complaints. Right? Part of what they're frustrated about is they feel, they did have this view, as Professor Hoffman said, that Assad's going to fall and we're going to lead that charge. But when it didn't, they've been looking to the United States to kind of orient regional allies. And the United States hasn't. Right? And that's, to me, been a frustration of mine, is that I don't feel we've done as good a job as we can to try to get our allies working together. And President Obama, when he was criticized for saying we don't have a strategy, one thing he did say, which I was pleased to see, was he emphasized that we need to get our allies working on this as well. That's not going to be a U.S. unilateral solution. So I would say a mix of those steps. It's always easier to say build capacity, right? But the Turks are actually pretty good, right? When they put their minds to it, I don't worry about their capacity. And it's more a political problem than a political decision. And that's often harder to change, but I do think the dynamic in terms of whether these guys are freedom fighters or terrorists, that has shifted in a way that can help the argument with the Turks. Yes?
Going back to your slides on the cycle of how the radicalization going to fight overseas and then coming back and plotting goes, do you have a rough estimate of what proportion goes on in any next stage? Because I think that has a lot of policy implications for different states in Europe. So for example, if you're Kosovo and you have a small security service and you have 40 guys that you need to fight in Syria, well, if half are going to want to plot, then it might make sense to just arrest all of them. But if you know that only 1% go to the next stage, well, 1% of 40 is less than 1, so it might make sense to just not touch them. So how do you go about figuring that out?
I've actually been trying to kind of piece this together, but there's a time lag problem, which is you don't expect an immediate response, right? And so the question is, of those who return, how long should you wait to see if they've done something? And then often there are people who have been fought in one conflict but were actually energized by something else, so it's kind of latent capacity, but I really want those numbers, and don't have them, right? So what I heard is that a number of services I talked to gave a ballpark estimate on average of roughly 10 to 15% will die in Syria. And roughly that number they believe will stay on. Now it might be different because they're creating an Islamic State, right? It's a different sort of place. People are trying to bring their families, right? So it creates a different dynamic. I mentioned the fighting in Syria is bloodier. But if you take that, which may even be a high number, that's still a lot of people coming back, right? And so how you deal with that, it's still a very big number of returnees. And then the real question to me is, how many are coming back and have no intention of doing anything versus how many do you have to disrupt? And that's a much tougher number. Yes, this time. I think there is a command and control issue. I think the drone campaign makes it much worse. I think in general the kind of constant intelligence collection, which has disrupted their ability to communicate via couriers, has been a problem. So it makes it harder to do more than provide strategic direction, although it's surprising how often they still have been involved, right? The wonderful New York Times story about a month ago on kidnapping for ransom. Talked about Al-Qaeda corps direct back and forth with people about individual hostages, right? And so it's still fairly involved. I think with the issue of the kind of the violent relationship between the two groups, it reminds me a bit of some of the problems between Palestinian groups, which we've seen in the past, which is, on the one hand, they hate each other and would happily see each other dead. On the other hand, the cause is popular and they want to co-opt the other side's cause. So it's very hard to condemn the Islamic State because a lot of the recruits they want to attract, a lot of the fundraisers they want to attract are sympathetic to what the Islamic State is doing. So what they want to do is say, they're mistaken. What they really want is to be part of us, right? Their real agenda is actually what we're doing. And so it's this strange kind of frenemy situation where politicians do this all the time, right? They're really good at, trying to get behind someone to stab them in the back, right? And so it's that strange mix of friendship and enmity. And So we saw the head of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula praise the Islamic State, right? Because I'm sure many of his local people are like, these guys are awesome, right? So it's hard for him to condemn them without risking further problems. But at the same time, they really have a problem on their hands, and I think how this manifests is going to be a huge issue. You want to chime in on this one, Bruce? Or? Yes.
Hi, Matthew. To what extent do you think the growth of ISIS affects the threat of nuclear terrorism?
I'm sorry, what devices?
The growth of ISIS affects the threat of nuclear terrorism.
I've always been somewhat of a skeptic on the nuclear terrorism front, so I remain a skeptic. That's different from a low-level radiological attack, right? So something, the question to me is the ability to acquire a nuclear weapon, the ability to then transport it, deliver it. There are lots of steps that are all actually quite difficult, and many of these groups aren't really focused on that issue. So I would say it's fairly unlikely. I'm still more worried about the Al-Qaeda core than I am about the Islamic State. It's not near any nuclear power. Right? It's not like it's going to conquer and overrun one. The way I'm worried about the Al-Qaeda core in Pakistan because there are nuclear weapons in Pakistan. Right? And so this doesn't frighten me terribly, but the old line about nuclear weapons where one could spoil your whole day, right? I mean, you want to be really sure on this issue, right? So I'm always a believer in wasting resources on this because just even the possibility of being wrong is actually rather terrifying.
I'll have to make this the last question.
Okay. That's a good question. I would say so far no. They seem to be eager to bring as many people under the fold. Part of what they're trying to do is create this create an Islamic State, and they want people to come in for it. I see another reason for them to limit their growth is actually military effectiveness. That there's a limit to a number of people they can absorb effectively. And so if they get huge surges in recruits, they can't always use them effectively. And at times we've seen groups, the Provisional IRA, Hezbollah, get smaller to become more effective. And so I think that's a possibility as well. But for now at least, I think it's full steam ahead. They really feel they're building a country, and they want as many people as possible.
Well, thank you very much for getting us off to such a great start. There'll be more Professor Byman. We're having a roundtable in a few weeks on drone attacks. That will feature Professor Byman and Professor Christine Fair and Professor Christopher Swift. Next week we will have the Inspector General for Afghanistan, John Sopko, speaking Friday the 12th at 4 p.m. So this is just a small taste of the program we have planned. So please come again. And Dan, thank you very much. That was great.